Hello there folks, I'm Dan Brown from sortofinteresting.com and today you are joining me on board good old Narrowboat Abel's Ark for episode 1 of my brand new boat life video series. Now this is going to simply be titled Dan's Narrowboat Basics, so if you see any videos on this YouTube channel with the DNB and a number next to them at the start of the video title, then you know that that's part of this basics video series. It's going to be a relatively informal conversational style of video where I cover different topics in each video and hopefully give some interesting information and things to think about for anybody out there who is new to boat life or considering moving on to the canals, or just of interest to people out there who may not get the chance to experience boat life themselves but want to just know and see a little bit more of the real life day-to-day experience of boat life and what it's all about, I suppose. So in this first episode, this is going to be a brief episode and it's going to be really extremely basic, as we're not even talking about even going to view boats at this point. I just want to take a moment to talk about the reasons why people might want to buy a boat or live on a boat, and the almost a reality check element to this video, I suppose, and some of the things that you may not have considered and may need to think about before you even go to look at boats with perhaps a romantic notion of boat life. Now, in recent times, there's been a greatly increased amount of interest in narrowboat life as a potential option. And personally, I think that that is down to two main reasons. You've firstly got the fact that there's been a lot of TV programmes in the UK showing you different elements of boat trips and things like that, celebrities on boats and all this sort of stuff, along with the fact that these are obviously TV programmes made to be entertaining and obviously show you these amazing summery scenes of the canal and these amazing rural locations and incredible history all around you, and it makes it look incredibly romantic. There's another element that's creating this increased interest in boat life as an option, and that is the fact that, well, basically, affording a dry land residence is becoming increasingly difficult and extraordinarily expensive, especially for a lot of young people and even now a lot of older people. Rents are going up, and the idea of actually trying to buy a house and convincing a bank to actually give you a mortgage is becoming a terrifyingly challenging proposition, as many people know, and that doesn't even have to be about young people. So that obviously then gives you the potential of looking at narrowboat life and thinking, this could be a cheap alternative way of life. It looks a bit like it'll be a laugh and stuff. So you've got the two elements where you've got the romantic element drawing people into boat life, and you've also got the pragmatic, realistic, I reckon that's probably a cheaper way to live element. And it can be a very cheap way to live. However, it can also be an incredibly expensive, a shockingly expensive way to live. The first area that I want to shine our reality check ray gun on is this idea of the perpetual summertime, perfect nomadic canal cruising lifestyle. Now, before we even talk about the weather and the potential that a bad winter can have for your day-to-day life, we need to talk about something extremely important about cruising on the canals as a whole, and that is the continuous cruising rules. So if you don't have a home mooring or a fixed mooring, say in a marina that you can leave your boat at indefinitely, you have to, if you're out and about on the canal, move at least every 14 days. And the rules don't specify how far you've got to move, it just says you have to move to a new place. And that lack of definition of what constitutes one place and the distance to another place can obviously lead to a bit of a grey area with a slightly controversial sort of mixed message element to it, where you could think you've moved far enough and the Canal and River Trust could say, hang on a minute, what are you doing still in this place? And again, that's a topic that I'll cover in a much more in-depth video in the future, but it's something that you need to be aware of, that every 14 days, if you're planning to be out and about on the canal as a whole, you've got to move to somewhere else. So if you're retired and just want to be out cruising on the canals in general over a few years of retirement and you're not worried about getting to a place of work or something like that, then it might not ever affect you and you might never think about it. However, if you're not able to work on the boat or you're not retired, then you may find yourself having to return obviously to a fixed place of work, like many of us do, And of course, every 2 weeks your boat could be getting steadily further and further and further away from where you wanted it to be. If you've got a car, that might not be too much of an issue, but you've also got to think immediately then where you're going to park the car in relation to where the boat is. Are you then taking the boat down a few miles and then having to come back and move the car to the nearest place you can get it to the canal? Because even up here on the Llangollen Canal, where there's a lot of country lanes that crisscross the canal network out here in the middle of nowhere, it's still very possible to find places where you can't park in a convenient place to have your boat moored up nearby, and that then starts to limit where you can maybe moor your boat if you want to be just a minute or two down the towpath from your car, which again then potentially throws up problems for you with the continuous cruising rules, because if your boat's locked to where you can park your car nearby, then you might start being in some places very often, rather than if, like me, you're only riding a little pedal powered bicycle, you're not having potentially that issue, because I can moor up in the middle of nowhere, hop on my bike, pedal down the towpath, find the nearest country lane, and then get into Oswestry town for work. Hopefully just that brief chat about one single rule relating to cruising on the canals has helped to give you that illustrative point about why I wanted this to be a bit of a reality check sort of video. That even one single thing like that can have so many different impacts on your life and change the way that your boat life may unfold, or make it easier or more difficult. And again, that's before we even talk about the natural elements of if you're planning to not have a marina mooring and just be out and about cruising on the canals, where you could potentially find yourself in the middle of historically wet winters that I did during 2015 to 16, where you literally don't have a day that it doesn't rain on for over 2 months. The wettest winter on record, historic flooding, and I was literally out in the middle of nowhere cruising around on my boat and having to travel in and out of work and things like that. And again, you can imagine pedalling down some of the country lanes in those conditions wasn't a pleasant, idyllic, and certainly not a summery, beautiful canal experience. And then getting back onto the boat with my wet clothes and steaming the place up before waking up and hopping on my bike to do it all again certainly wasn't living the dream, I'll say that much. But obviously with any form of life you have to expect there to be good and bad elements to it. It just so happens that if you're on a boat, in my opinion at least, you're far closer to nature, not only because if you're mooring up in these rural places you're seeing more of the natural countryside and rural outdoors and what have you than if you're living in the middle of a town or a city, but because obviously if you've got to move your boat and if you're in rural places moving around, you're not always going to have facilities and things like that. Shops even, just simple things like a little corner shop, sometimes I've had to walk many miles to go and get a few supplies. So obviously you're closer to nature in that way, that you're sort of forced to see it far more often. And again, in the bad winter weather, especially if you're keeping up with the continuous cruising rules and mooring in some obscure places because of it, you're potentially going to have some very long commutes, some very long walks down muddy towpaths. So if you're out viewing boats in the middle of summer and you've got seating in the bow area or on the stern, and you're there under the sun thinking, oh yeah, could just buy this boat and take it down the canal and sit out on the back eating our tea or having a drink and reading the newspaper, listening to the radio, the blazing sun in the sky, it can be easy to look at that boat and think, oh, this seems perfect. But it's a realistic thing that you've got to think about, that you might be out in the middle of nowhere, seeing day after day of rain, not really being able to do much because it's such bad weather all the time, living in a little 6'10" wide steel tube, thinking, is this all that life is? And again, if you've got that going on for month after month, believe me, it's not a pleasant experience. So if I haven't scared you off with talk about cruising rules and bad weather, there's the other elements that we mentioned at the start of this video. The idea that boat life is a cheap way of life. Now, this is something that can be absolutely true. When I lived on my very small basic boat in years gone by, my boat running costs for the year were roughly between £1,000 and £1,500 a year, and that's just for running the boat. That's not including food and things like that. But even that, consider the cost of running that little tiny boat, which, to be fair, wasn't really suitable to live on long term, but it was great fun to do it for 4 years. In all seriousness though, consider £1,500 a year to what it costs you to even rent a place rather than buy a place yourself, if you're talking about dry land, of course. So it can be a hugely reduced cost living on a boat. However, that's not universally true. When I lived on my other boat, I rarely spent any time in a marina, so the biggest cost of the year that I would have had if I'd have chosen to live in a marina all year round, which would have been my mooring costs, would have, well, obviously made a huge difference on that £1,500 a year total figure. It could have literally trebled that figure, maybe even more. And depending on what part of the country you're in and what the shortage or abundance of mooring spaces is like in your particular stretch of the canal network, it's just like house prices. A city, it could cost you an absolute fortune to moor your boat up. The mooring's likely going to be based on the length of your boat, so a bigger boat would cost more to moor, and a smaller boat would cost less to moor. Less and more. Less is more. Anyway, let's not get into that. You could easily, in some places, be potentially paying £5,000 plus a year just to moor your boat, depending on the location and the size of your boat. And again, just consider how expensive that is, to say that you're paying that money out and you don't own a proper bricks and mortar property. You're living in a boat, which, again, for all the best will in the world, and I love boats and I love boat life, but it's still a steel tube that's floating around, slowly rusting away in a bit of water. You're not expecting it to have the endless potential sort of staying power of your house price value if you're investing in property rather than a boat. And of course, there's always going to be potential work to go on a boat. Now, even though you're unlikely to have major structural changes going on a regular basis, there's always the consideration you've got to make. Unlike a house, which obviously has its own set of different objects in it, like boilers and stuff like that, that could go wrong and cost a fortune, your boat has got obviously your living space, your electrics and your gas and your heating or whatever systems like that you've got, but it's also got an engine. So potentially you've got some of the costs of a house with some of the costs of, say, something like a car where things can go wrong all the time and need fixing. And there's people who've bought boats and had terrible luck and had to spend a fortune on little odd jobs on board and things to do with the engine and that have gone wrong. And then there's other people who've been extremely lucky to have perfect luck, live an absolutely beautiful, very low-cost life, cruising around on the canal on a brand new boat that they may have spent a fortune on, but still, after that initial price, some people are very lucky to go out and have years and years where they're living practically on a shoestring budget. So again, there's huge amounts of variation, huge amounts of things that can go wrong. And like I say, if you find yourself planning to continuously cruise but then end up having to go in a marina long term, that could literally treble or more your annual boat life running costs. And of course, with general inflation making things like food and general shopping and supplies and things like phones and internet access and stuff, they're always constantly on that incline. So of course, trebling your budget could be only the beginning of your problems. Right, I hope that this has been a suitably jolly video. It's all been bad. I don't mean to be this negative. I must apologise. But as I say, the idea was this is the introductory episode and this is the reality check. This is what boat life can be like, what it is like sometimes, and what you've got to be prepared for boat life to be like. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning into this video. It's been incredibly negative. I apologise. Please do consider checking out my other videos and subscribing. I've got all sorts of videos from my previous Narrowboat and obviously getting back on board with Abel's Ark. Please do consider checking out my short books about boat life for the Kindle. It really helps me out. And if you're really generous, please consider checking out my Patreon as well. I'm releasing my current book that I've been working on over the last year about my return to canal life as a free book in monthly instalments, both as a written book and an audio book. It's on YouTube, available for everybody to enjoy and listen to, and that's sort of in return for me finally setting up a Patreon. So if you want to support that, that's absolutely fantastic, and thank you to those of you who do. But no pressure. Anyway, you'll find loads of links to all that stuff in the description, as well as finding me on Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram, where I post loads of boat life pictures and things like that in general. And I suppose all that's left for me to say, my friends, is have an absolutely fantastic 2019. Keep it interesting, keep it boat worthy, and of course, my friends, have a fantastic day and farewell.